Welcome everybody to our next in series of CPD in 43, where we have Dan Rossiter from the BSI, who will be giving us a update on UK BIM Framework. I'll leave it there, and as mentioned, I will do a Q&A session towards the end of the talk with Dan, and then also highlight all of our upcoming events that we have leading all the way up to the end of the year. So please do stay for the Q&A session, and also please do sign up for our future events. Without further ado, I hand it straight over to Dan. I will hide in the background, but I am still here. I am manning the chat box, etc., and I can be called in to come back into video as well. So I will see you all shortly.
Oh, that's great. Thank you, Usman. And thank you to everyone at the team behind CPD in 43. What I'll do is I will share my screen. So as mentioned, what I'm going to do today is talk about the UK BIM framework. And just before that, I'll just give you a little bit of blurb about myself. I promise not to spend too long on that before we get into the meat of today's presentation. So I'm Dan Rossiter. I am Head of Built Environment Interim at the British Standards Institution. Hopefully those of you who have seen me around will know that I'm one of our fellows and a chartered architectural technologist, and I'm currently the counsellor for the Wales region as well. From a BIM point of view, I currently am the co-convener of the UK BIM Framework Strategy Board, which is one of the reasons why I'm talking to you today about the UK BIM Framework, where I spent a number of years contributing to British, European and international standards as a committee member, and spent a number of years developing training, doing consulting services and auditing people on the way that they do BIM. And ultimately, from a publication point of view, I am the author of There's No BIM Like Home, which you might have seen in the AT Journal, co-author of the Scottish Global BIM Study that came out a few years ago, and maybe more excitingly, an upcoming BSI Agile Standard, Flex 1965. I'm the co-author of that, which is trying to help client and contracting authorities specify BIM. So there's lots of different pieces going on at the moment, and it's a fairly exciting time on what's going on, which is why I thought it would be good to come and give an update on everything that's going on. Rough outline for today. First is introductions, which I've done. So we've already knocked off one of our 5 parts of the agenda. I'm going to talk a little bit about the BIM and information management mandates, where they've come from, where it's the current state of play, which hopefully gives you the relevance of why we're talking about this today. Focus a little bit on what is BIM in case those of you are not too aware of it, what's going on. And then the meat of the presentation is to focus on the UK BIM framework and some of the key elements within that. So first, various mandates. What's happened quite interestingly is that back in around 2013 was the announcement of the UK's first BIM mandate. And the idea being that as of 2016, there was a requirement on public sector works to do BIM. Since then, it's quite frankly accelerated very rapidly across the world, with various images and infographics being done. This one I particularly like. You can see from Geospatial World, I think it was pulled from an academic paper, showing the various mandates there are internationally to show that following the UK, lots of different countries have set out their requirements for people to do BIM, which has shown one, the popularity of it, but also considering the global nature of our members. It might be that even if you are based in the UK and doing work internationally, or you're an international member wanting to do work in the UK, the fact that there are these various mandates and requirements globally shows that understanding the good practice relating to BIM is quite an important thing. Now, here specifically in the UK, we have various government policy documents that start to outline some of these requirements. I've put some of them there on the right-hand side. So it's things like the construction playbook. So published by sort of the HM government themselves, the construction playbook talks about how contracting authorities, i.e. public sector who go out and commission works, should use the UK BIM framework to standardize their approach to generating, classifying, securing and exchanging their information. So it really sets out an ask that if you work in the public sector and you commission projects, that you really should be doing this. And you can see a small pie chart in the top corner. What I've actually done is pulled data from the Office of National Statistics, looked at the costs of works in the UK for 2020, and you can see that the public sector accounts for over a quarter of the works in the UK. So in theory, if you're not going to look at any of this, then you're cutting yourself off potentially to over a quarter of the available work that's out there. And that's forgetting any private sector people who might look at the public sector and go, you know what, that was quite good, maybe I want to do that, or any of the base benefits. Simply from a benchmarking point of view, it's going to be a requirement on a fair amount of work. The detail is provided in the Infrastructure and Planning Authority's TIP roadmap. Within that, it talks about specifically the fact that there is an information management mandate, and that is how the UK BIM framework will get implemented. And it also calls back to the construction playbook. So it's saying, those of you who read the construction playbook, this is how you meet the goals within that document. And it sets out various requirements, which I'll go on to in a sec. The key point I'll make, however, is that this is for central government, but that doesn't mean it's the only thing that's happening here in the UK. If you have a look at Scotland, they have specific procurement policy notices, SSPN 01/2017, which calls for BIM on projects that are valued over 2 million in their public sector. And in Northern Ireland, there's a similar document, PGN 03/15, which requires it for projects over 4.1 million, which I believe used to be the old kind of OJU threshold sort of figure. And in Wales, well, what remains to be seen. But the point is that, for across the UK, there are various different requirements. Focusing on central government, there are a number of things that are required of someone if they are doing various bits and pieces around BIM. The first is that they need to conform to the UK BIM framework standards. And we'll talk about those standards in just a little bit in terms of what they are and what's happening to them. Those contracting authorities need to follow the sensitivity assessment in ISO 19650 Part 5. So they need to understand, are they dealing with commercially or kind of personal sensitive information, or dealing with sensitive assets, in which case there are additional security requirements that come into play. They need to have the capability to fulfill their own information management function. Now, the topic of function has come up quite a lot just outside of BIM as well when it comes to building safety and other areas. In brief, what we're talking about is that it's not just about asking the supply chain, I need you to do BIM. It's about ensuring that the bits that are required from the client, the appointing party, contracting authority, whichever phrase you want to use, that they do their own bits as well. And we'll talk about what some of those bits are in a little. But they have a role to play in this as well. So it can't all just be delegated out. The idea that there's some form of digital mechanism to store any information you've procured from those projects, things like any of the drawings, as-built information, any records, schedules, and various certificates and those things as well as part of that. They need to define their information requirements. And specifically, there is various documentation resources need to be produced, but ultimately defining what's known as the exchange information requirements, which outline for that particular appointment the information that's needed by them as part of it. So effectively an extension of the brief in a way. And they need to be specifically put into the contract documents. So the idea being that actually by not meeting those requirements, you're in breach of contract. So it puts a kind of real kind of weight on them to ensure that they get fulfilled. And ultimately, what they need to do is apply the same rigor to acquiring the information as they do for maintaining it. There's no point spending all this time and effort to ask for complex digital representations of things, clever schedules, and lots of detailed product information if it isn't kept up to date. Because the minute it's not up to date, or people don't believe it's up to date, it becomes useless. So there's a requirement there to ensure that there's that proper maintenance rigor. And this is all the things that the client has to do. So there's probably an important part for us as chartered architects, or as architectural technologists more generally, to ensure that clients are aware that these are the sort of things that they need to do if they are asking for someone to do information management using BIM or to follow the 19650 series. So what is BIM? There are various different definitions and things that come around. Obviously, as British standards, I'm going to lean to the definition that we have in our own standards, which I've put up on the screen there. You can see that building information modeling, or BIM, is the use of a shared digital representation of an asset to facilitate design, construction, and operation processes to form a reliable basis for decisions. And then just to break down those two extra terms there, a digital representation is basically a data element representing properties of an asset. So in this instance, digital representation could be of of a house, of a school, of an estate as part of that process. And an asset being anything that has actual or potential value to that organization. So it's scalable in that sense. So if we're talking in the context of something like HS2, it could be more at the program level, where if we're starting to talk about house extensions and kind of modest kind of retrofit and renovation works, you might be getting to parts of buildings. But the point is that there's a scalability to that. Now, what's interesting is that that description ultimately is saying use a digital thing to help make decisions. And that's ultimately what BIM is. However, there's a strong misconception in industry to the point where if I go into Google Images, I just search for BIM, what I actually see are mostly 3D images. And it's this idea that people have is that to do BIM, you need to have a complex 3D model or some sort of 3D representation to do so. And that's strictly not true. The idea is that you need an appropriate digital representation, and that for smaller, less complex projects, something that is two-dimensional or even something without any graphics at all could be appropriate. If you're thinking of, maybe an asset management kind of repair activity, doesn't necessarily need a 3D model to replace a boiler, but you can still do these information management processes of asking for details around the warranty information, ensuring that a like-for-like product's been used, and finding out various bits and pieces in that way. So it doesn't need to be 3D, it needs to be appropriate for the project and the work that takes place. And interestingly with that, there's always been a focus on what used to be known as kind of BIM levels, focusing on BIM maturity. Now, the difficulty is that there were some fairly kind of infamous diagrams that went around for this. The first one being the Bew-Richards maturity diagram, which was great at the time. It showed us all the different BIM levels and the way that someone might progress from doing CAD into starting to think about the processes that needed to be done, described in some of the Avanti documentation and BS 1192, moving then into more use case based stuff to support BIM level 2, and then focusing in the future around kind of more kind of internationally focused bits that focus on developing the ISO standards and everything else. The problem, however, was that instead of focusing on those early levels and getting the basics right, people were trying to stretch into the future and were trying to predict things or gain market advantage by talking about higher levels. Bear in mind that we only went as far as defining BIM level 2 properly here in the UK. You had various organizations who would start talking about what BIM level 3 were. So you had sort of general kind of media-based places, as well as some large kind of software vendor style organizations. Other professional institutions talked about BIM level 4, which then started to confound things a bit more difficult, as well as other software vendors. You found then that looking at news outlets again, and through some books and publications, people were talking about BIM level 5. And going even further than that, there were conversations, admittedly, in the early kind of 2016s, talking as far as BIM level 6. Now, some of these were confusing this idea of maturity levels with dimensions, where people would think, well, you have 3D, you add a bit of time, it goes to 4D, and then they might have called that level 4 by accident. But what it caused was real confusion in the marketplace, to the point where, fairly, again, infamous kind of jokes were made as a result. Some of you may have seen this before. This was the old BIM level 8 maturity diagram, which was a parody diagram created to effectively make fun of this stretch and this overreach people having about how far these BIM levels were going. And really, it wasn't a way that we could continue, and something needed to change. In doing so and looking at that problem, the decision was made that actually, instead of focusing on having different levels of maturity, what if we had a static wrapper, a single thing that we called it, but the actual good practice could evolve within it so that it kept up to date with current good practice, but was effectively the benchmark we wanted people to achieve. And that's effectively what the UK BIM framework is. So, the UK BIM framework. The UK BIM framework itself is the overarching approach to implementing BIM in the UK. The idea being that it's the wrapper that goes around these international standards that covers all the extra bits to help someone who is either in the UK or doing projects in or behalf of the UK to do BIM in a consistent manner, focusing on UK good practices. To do so, it includes a few different bits and pieces. The first are the standards. So they has the international standards from the ISO 19650 series, but there are also some UK specific standards that are a part of that schedule as well. There's guidance. There's freely available guidance that helps to explain and clarify some of the interpretations that can be derived from the standards, as well as having examples and kind of thoughtful breakdowns of what some of these things mean and their practical implications. And resources, additional things like tools, templates, videos, infographics, just help to either explain or provide additional benefits and kind of quality of life aspects to support the implementation of those standards. Now, the framework itself is actually co-managed by us, the British Standards Institution, and the UK BIM Alliance. We manage it together, and we have a number of collaborators who have joined us. And the idea that those collaborators are people like various government departments, some non-centralized government bodies who have come together alongside people like the Construction Industry Council and the Construction Leadership Council, who sit there and look at what needs to be part of the framework to ensure its success for the future, and also to ensure that it helps support government with things like the construction playbook and the Transforming Infrastructure Performance Roadmap. To do so, it's effectively set out as 3 boards. There's a strategic board that oversees it and looks to agree whether new material needs to go in there. So for example, if someone comes to us and has a paper specifically on a topic, say it was to do with how BIM can support net zero and the capturing of embodied energy, then we can look at that and see, agree, actually, is that a good fit for the UK BIM framework as a whole, and work out what to do next. If the answer was yes, it would be sent to the review board. And the idea then that the review board are able to look at it, look at what changes need to be made to ensure that the standards, guidance and tools work cohesively together as part of that, and can arrange that as part of that process. And then ultimately there's a comms board as well, which helps update and maintain the website, manage any social media, and produces various marketing and comms material, as well as arranging things like presentations at events and conferences to help with the discovery and dissemination of the framework. So in theory, there's a management process in place in the background to ensure that it's filled with the right content, that it is cohesive and works together as part of it. Now, I mentioned there are various parts. The first, arguably, I would say, as someone who works for British Standards, the most important are the standards. Currently, there are several standards that are outlined in the UK BIM framework. I won't go into them into detail, although you're more than welcome to ask me afterwards, and I can do a deeper dive on any of them if you needed me to. But the idea being that the top one, part 0, is the transition guide. Those of you who are used to the 1192 series and the PASs, it provides some additional detail about moving from the PASs to the 19650 series. 19650 Part 1 deals with concepts and principles. If you're fairly new to the world of BIM and information management and want to know what it's about, I suggest that's a great place to start, as it talks about the various core concepts that need to be incorporated to effectively do good information management. This includes things like collaborative working, information delivery planning, utilizing a common data environment. Parts 2 and Part 3 effectively do the same job, but for different parts of the life cycle. During design and construction, Part 2 outlines the activities that should take place before project teams are appointed, and then what happens then during their appointment to the end of those projects. While Part 3 focuses on asset management, but in that same way of before asset management activities are started and the process there. So when I mentioned before about developing exchange information requirements or weaving them into contract documents, it's those sorts of activities that are covered in those standards. BS 1192 Part 4 covers COBie. What COBie is a defined way of exchanging information. So the idea being that you can set out in a formalized way things like the name of the building, the floors that are within it, the spaces on those floors, the components that need to be managed through asset and facility management within those spaces. And it gives it in a formalized way that it makes it more easier for it to be imported into CAFM systems and asset management systems. As mentioned, if potentially it's a secure, there are some security risks or there's a sensitive asset, Part 5 starts to go into those additional security-minded approaches. And then part 6 covers health and safety, with then a kind of specific one then on operability, which is the BS 8536 standard, which looks at actually that relationship between design and construction teams and asset management, which covers things like soft landings and ensuring that design intent and the ability to look after and maintain it are considered during design and construction. Now, I say currently because there are changes planned constantly as part of this. As I mentioned, the UK BIM Framework has a static name. It's always going to be called the UK BIM Framework, but it evolves in the sense that when new good practice comes about, it can then be incorporated in. So, for example, later this year, BS 1192 Part 4 is going to be replaced with ISO 19650 Part 4. What that's going to do is it's not just looking at COBie, it's looking at information exchanges more generally. So if you're giving information to another design team, giving information back to a client, giving it to a third party, to a local authority, what are some of the good practices to make sure that information is cohesive, coherent, consistent, and generally a good set of information? And in the same way, work is being taken place to develop PAS 1192 Part 6 into an ISO standard covering health and safety again as part of that, so we can bring it in line with the other UK documents that have moved up and become international good practice. And while this is the current list, that doesn't mean other standards might not make it in the future as well. For example, and these have yet to be discussed, so there's no way I can say either way, but things like the standard I mentioned at the start that I've been co-authoring on actually how do you specify BIM in contracts, that one Flex 1965 could potentially form part of the UK BIM framework in the future. Those of you who've been following building safety and some of the activity relating to Golden Thread will know that we as British Standards have been working on BS 8644 Part 1, which relates to the digital management of fire safety information. That one is due out, I believe, at the end of this month, which potentially could form part of the framework. And then you have things like how to create effectively BIM implementation specifications, what some of you might call BIM manuals for in-house, is covered in ISO 12911. And you have things like the IFC standard 16739 Part 1, which covers data structures, which either could form part of or be identified as a supporting element of the UK BIM framework. So there are lots of things happening, constantly evolving, so it's well worth keeping note of the website you can see at the bottom, and just making sure that you're up to date with the current standards and things that are set out at the time that you start your project. In terms of Part 5, I mentioned that security assessment. Brief version of it I've put on the screen. You can see the figure. It's been pulled directly from 19650 Part 5. And the idea is just to look at your project and ask 3 fairly simple questions. First is the project itself considered sensitive? You know, if you're working on a house extension, you know, probably not. If you're working on a brand new prison for the Ministry of Defence, probably yes. As part of working on this project, will you be capturing information about a different organization? And then, you know, as part of that, if it's a large complex project, you might be borrowing from other people. There might be some consortia and other bits and pieces, which will answer whether that's a yes or no. And then as part of the information you're collecting about that other organization, is it things that are fairly kind of publicly available, or are they considered sensitive? And by answering yes or no to these 3 questions, it effectively gives you a security triage rating that tells you what you need to protect. Ultimately, if you hit ST4 at the bottom, which is the least amount of protection, that's really about making sure things like GDPR and commercially sensitive information are protected. It's the lowest level. And then as you go up, then it's actually about protecting sensitive third-party information, sensitive project information, or both. So if you go through this triage process, or a client goes through it and they get a score of an ST1, 2, or 3, the idea being is that there should be something like a security management plan developed, which might have additional security requirements to be weaved into the project. And if you score an ST4, you may not need to do those, but you may wish to do them if it looked practical, or there may be additional benefits for doing it anyway. But I think that gets covered more on a project by project basis. On top of the standards, we have guidance. Now, the guidance has gone through a fair bit of evolution But in its newest form, it's now on an online portal called Notion, which means it makes it more easily to accessible and it's very searchable. So using the link that'll down the bottom, or just go in on the UK BIM Framework website and clicking on guidance, you get access to that online portal. And what's happened is that industry experts have come together and volunteered and developed additional information to help clarify and explain different parts of the BIM process. And in doing so, they go through various bits and pieces. For example, in guidance part A, it talks about that information management function and the different responsibilities people have. Looking at this diagram here, you can see that what they've done is they've taken the clause numbers out of 19650 and color coded them. So in this example here, if you were a client, let's say you're a local authority and you were commissioning a brand new primary school, in theory, those bits in that kind of lighter blue, sort of slightly teal color, those as default are your responsibilities. So there's an awful lot that should happen even before the design teams are actually looked at to be appointed, because what they've got to do is they've got to start to sit there and look at what are their organizational requirements, their asset requirements, start to pull together some tender documentation before they go out and advertise that the work's going to take place. You then have those kind of darker blue kind of bits in there that you can see, and those are for lead organizations. Now, when I say a lead organization, that's someone who's been directly appointed by the client. So typically you might refer to those as tier ones. But in the early design process, that's likely to be an architectural team, or maybe the structural engineers or similar if they've been appointed directly. And then they have responsibilities about trying to work out this, how to plan the work out in terms of what deliverables are needed, who is responsible for what, and ensuring that the works will meet the initial requirements set by the client. And then once that's done, you have that kind of light kind of purple bits, which are actually then only applicable when you are doing the work. So if you are a subcontractor or in a, say, design and build process, you come in as an architectural team supporting a tier one contractor, you'd only need to worry about those lighter kind of purple bits there, because as part of that, that's just doing the work in the sense of following the methods and procedures that have been outlined for the project, completing an information delivery plan that shows what documents you're going to be producing, and then doing appropriate approval processes. So it's part of that. Makes it very easy then to split out. Okay, I'm a X. These are the activities that I need to do on a project, and quickly you go from 40 tasks potentially down to 6 or 7. So it helps just make the standards a bit more digestible for people who may not have been as familiar with them in the past. I mentioned procurement and the need for various different documents to be developed. Here's a list of some of the things that the client or contracting authority should produce. Now, the idea is that these should be weaved into the invitation to tender documentation. So when producing a proposal back, you can actually make it appropriate allowances for meeting some of these requirements. Now, it looks like a fairly hefty list of things, but the important thing to note is that they don't have to be standalone documents. In the past, I've worked with a local authority that actually merged their exchange information requirements with their normal exchange requirements. So the idea being that effectively as part of their brief going out, they would ask for things like, please confirm, the colors of various materials before, they are procured so that they can be installed in kitchen units and those sorts of things. And when they discover those are actually information requirements, they realize that in their normal brief, when they go out for works, they already have a lot of these kind of information requirements built in. So what we did was we just effectively moved them out into a different chapter of the document, and it actually took the role of both of these things. In the same way, you can see later down the list, you have the information standard and the information production methods and procedures. These are effectively the rules on the project that govern how information is produced and managed. Things like, what are the file naming conventions? If you use a classification system, what is it? What are the steps to getting something signed off or getting something spatially coordinated? And they could be put together into a single document. But the idea is that they need to each be considered, and something needs to be written relating to them, whether they form part of a different document or not as immaterial, but thought needs to be given to them. Which means that if a client is unsure about them, it might be our role as architectural technologists and potentially as a lead appointed party, because we've been appointed directly by them to advise them on these are the sort of documents you should have in place, and actually help them to develop them and create them. So just because it's their responsibility doesn't mean that we may not have a role in actually supporting them in trying to create them. And ultimately, there are also resources there. So various things that can actually help support both you on your journey or anyone else in terms of the way that they work. Some things you can see on there, there are external links. So links out to things like Uniclass, the UK's, in theory, official classification system for built environment works. Any news items, there are some interesting videos, such as the back to basics stuff, where if you're very much starting on your journey, it focuses on some of the basic principles, as well as some case study stuff where we've got actual practitioners talking about their experiences. There's some additional guidance focused on government soft landings, and we're in the process of getting some interesting bits around CDM and the digital way of doing CDM developed into there, as well as things like templates and infographics. So just to quickly check it on the screen, there are infographics like the one I'm showing here that just try and help to dive a little more into the various different parts of the BIM process. So you can look at this and focus on where you sit and where the right standards or guidance might be for it. For example, if you are an organization that typically does that lead role, then that third one down, plan how and when to deliver it, is something that you might be part of in terms of developing procedures. And it suggests, well, you might want to read guidance part C and guidance part F. And it points to the right parts in the standards, which are around clause 5.5, where you can read into what the requirements are for it. So through a mix of 1, the standards, 2, that guidance, and 3, the resources, it provides all that additional benefit and meat to support someone on their journey to do BIM in the UK's approach outlined in the UK BIM Framework. So, in summary, governments, be them central, Scottish, or Northern Irish, however not Welsh, require the use of BIM on public sector projects. As seen, potentially, public sector projects make up a fairly significant amount of the work that happens here in the UK. So by ensuring that you are upskilled, capable, or at least cognizant of the requirements here, potentially allows you to access to that work that might be shut off otherwise because you're not aware of BIM and information management. In asking for it, they require that the standards that form part of the UK BIM framework need to be conformed to. In which case, then it's by understanding what those standards ask for and ensuring that you're able to deliver those bits if needed. So ultimately, my only ask for today is go to ukbimframework.org and become familiar with those standards, the guidance, and the resources, so that if on your current projects or on future projects, you're asked to either follow these processes or to support someone else in doing them, you are able to do so, and do so by following what is the UK's preferred approach, all outlined within the UK BIM framework. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dan. Obviously, we're opening up for the Q&A session, so please do ask any questions within the chat box, and we'll field them to Dan. In the meantime, I'll just start off with a probably quite simple question. You've highlighted that this is specifically for public sector work, although that does cover quite a large variety of work within the UK. What principles or benefits do you see in implementing the BIM framework within work that may not fall under the requirement? So, for example, private sector, could be commercial, could be mixed use, and then maybe then even tailing all the way back down to small domestic work as well.
It's a good question as well. I think it's what's interesting is that there are 2 ways that can go. One is that there are large private organizations who ask for it anyway. And there are plenty of organizations out there, large housing associations, things like shops as private clients, so people like, Asda, Lidl, those sorts of people, I know for a fact ask for it on projects. So just because it's a requirement on the public sector doesn't mean private clients aren't going to require it anyway. But obviously they have the choice of deciding whether they want to ask for it or not. But ultimately, I think there's some good practice in there And I think so long as it's looked at in a proportionate way, that there are actually just benefits selfishly of doing it for yourself, even if no one else on the project tries to do it. So for example, when it comes to just in producing information as a design practice, it has things like in there outlining first what deliverables you plan to do, and then assigning them to people, having a consistent naming convention, having a good approval process before it leaves the office. I mean, there's a good chance people have that anyway, in which case they're already following that part, but they just don't realize maybe that they are following those standards. So just by knowing it, you could turn around and go, actually, oh, I've been doing this for 5-10 years. I just didn't know it was basically doing a BIM thing. But at the same time, by looking at those standards and incorporating it, there are elements that they could bring in to help streamline your design practices. I spent a number of years auditing companies, and you'd be shocked how many drawing title blocks, for example, don't show who the approver was as a simple thing, or actually doesn't have a unique reference for that drawing. It might say proposed ground floor plan, but doesn't have a unique reference for it or a revision. So actually, what happens when you've revised that drawing and someone says, well, actually, no, I want you to go back to the previous one, version 3, where it's very hard to find because you haven't got that document management process in place. So I think by looking at it and going, well, no one's asking me to do it, but if I did these 3 things anyway, they help me personally, you're closer to the benchmark, you're doing better as an organization without anyone asking for it. And then as soon as someone does ask for it, that leap is smaller as a result. So I think there are benefits. And even silly things like there was a report that came out from Autodesk about the cost of bad data, and it's like billions because it results in rework. And there was a scary stat that came out that roughly in office work more generally, 25% of a work week is accounted for in looking for information. And whenever I ask people about it, it's scary in the sense of I ask people, how often do you sit there and click through folders to try and find something? And people would honestly say hours of a week are spent looking for stuff. And it's these sorts of things that BIM stuff can help resolve, regardless of if you've been told contractually to go for it. So I think there are lots of benefits.
Interesting. In essence, what you're saying is that, excuse the use of the language that is being used for this new box of information, but in essence, what you're talking about is a framework to then tag on to, and dependent on your level of appetite or your level of wanting to get involved with this area, you could obviously take principles, you could obviously get fully immersed and gear up to be ready to work for large corporates who may not be part of the government, but also require these standards, but then also gear up towards potentially doing government work, which specifically require these elements.
Yes.
So we've got quite a few really good questions. So I'll kick off with the first one. So thank you, Taj, for your question. I'll just read it verbatim. So thank you for the great CPD. Can I ask about your experience with how fire engineering is represented in BIM? Is it thorough enough? Does it require development? And secondly, can you tell us more about some recommendations in BS 8644-1 to be released by the end of the month? Is there any other guidance and resources one would be able to refer to? Thank you. Obviously, if that's too specific, then please feel free to sort of maybe go over it in lightly, and I potentially would suggest, if needed, then maybe have a discussion outside.
No, that's fine. It'll be a light answer. I guess historically, fire engineering wasn't well represented, but that's what 8644 Part 1 is doing quite well. And I can't remember what's in the standard verbatim, but I do know that there were lots of fire engineers who are actually actively involved. One of the main co-authors is a fire engineer, and what it covers roughly is 2 parts. The first is a management process for that digital management of fire safety information, which talks about things like when a fire engineer should be engaged, the sort of information that's needed for various parties to ensure fire and structural safety. And then it also then goes into how you structure information to support that exchange as well. So there's a lot of really good stuff in there. So hopefully, Taj, when you have a look at it, it will meet those sorts of needs. And in terms of other guidance and resourcing, probably the best thing to do is you would have received an email today, I think, from info@architectural technology, which talked about a CIBSE event in September, which is going into the golden thread and fire safety more generally, where 8644 will be covered in a specific slot. I think I'm presenting it. So that's a very good place to find out more specifically about that standard, and there will be a launch CPD for it as well, which I will find the details for afterwards and share with Usman maybe as some post presentation notes.
On that point, I'm not sure if everyone would have received that. So what I will do is I'll share a link within the chat box, and we'll try and get something out to all of the attendees who officially registered via Eventbrite. If you don't get the information that you require, please do get in touch with us directly, and we will try and endeavour to send that across. Thank you for all the great questions coming through. So we've got a second one, which is from Fadi. Great presentation, thank you. Are there certifications or accreditations from the framework for trainers, consultants and lecturers, for example?
No, there isn't, and I'll put a due diligence hat on in that I work very much on the national standards body side of BSI, so I know that we do training and certification stuff, but for purity, I'm not allowed near those things. So I do know that there are offerings on that, but they're not endorsed by the framework themselves proper. So there's nothing framework endorsed.
Okay, and then to be honest, Stuart, thank you for the question. It's very short and sweet, but what are the benefits of BIM?
It is a short and sweet one. So high level, it's about being able to make decisions earlier in the life cycle that impact on an asset. And there's a very interesting bit of work called the McLeamy curve that Patrick McLeamy coined, where you effectively, if you imagine a graph, and I'm going to describe this graph visually instead of doing something clever by Google searching it and then sharing it. But the idea being that as you go across the life cycle of a project, you have more impact and it costs less to change things earlier on. So if you imagine in the early design stages, if you wanted to move a door, dead easy. It's 10 seconds worth of work, it doesn't cost anything. Whereas once you've gone past planning, that could be affecting the external facade and you get some problems there. Building control starts to affect the fire strategy. And once it's built, there's thousands of pounds worth of remediation works and changes. Through BIM, the idea is that through creating these digital representations, you can get the right information and ask the right questions so that you can tackle these problems at an earlier stage than you might have when it comes up. So instead of finding out that beam's going to clash while you're on site, you discover that during the early design process. So really, it's bringing decisions earlier in so you have more control and a less cost associated to them. And I think that's probably the biggest benefit.
Great. Thank you for that. We've got a question in from Cox. Where the client requirements reference PAS 1192, should we be responding according to British standards and terminologies which are withdrawn, or respond with ISO's current but not what has been specified as a standard?
Well, I think in that exact scenario, that's where I think an RFI is the perfect thing. So I think it's about going back with a request for information and just to say, we have identified that what you've asked for isn't current good practice. Can you please confirm whether you want us to respond based on good practice or based on what's specified? And what I'm conscious of is that when you look at things like something like HS2, something like Crossrail, which very recently finished, but you think when Crossrail started, iPads weren't even a thing. So it could be that for consistency for that client or that authority, it might be that they've had a 10, 12-year program and they don't want to change this final thing based on the fact that they've done everything else a different direction. But I think this is why we have mechanisms like requests for information during tender processes. So you can maybe go back, ask the question to get that clarity. But I'd make sure that you spoke to them first and not assumed either way, because there could be good reasons for sticking with the withdrawn content for continuity, or actually they weren't aware of the ISO standards and actually they benefit from understanding that to then bring themselves up to date. But I think it's ask first.
Definitely. We've got a question in from Michael. Thank you all. Great presentation. From an academic point of view, what advice can you give on how to teach this latest BIM framework to students? And then second part of the question is, how can we access additional resources to support their learning and understanding of BIM and its implementation?
No, thank you, Michael. So two parts to that. For your second part, there is on the UK BIM framework a learning outcomes framework, which is meant to outline some of the competencies that students should have from training, be it academic or vocational, around BIM. Now, I'll be the first to be honest that there's work to improve that document, which is a very political way of me saying something else. But the idea is that that could be a great starting point to look at what should be put in for students. Personally, what I've seen is too many universities focus on teaching the software skills around how to do something like Revit or those sorts of things, as opposed to looking at the fundamentals of collaborative working and setting out some of those processes. And what I found interesting was when I spoke to a few course leaders around what I called secret BIM. And in that way of when you set out a project brief for something, you tend to do a breakdown of, you'll get 10% for good referencing and those sorts of things in the overall breakdown. But if there's a 10% for following my required format, where you told them, here's a specific naming convention you've got to use for this report, I want it to be in these chapters and I want it colored this way or something, you're effectively providing them experience of having a kind of a deliverable based manual that they would follow, and then when they then go into practice and they're told you have to name your drawings this way or use these layers and do that thing, it's slightly more natural to them because they've had to follow a similar set of instructions even as part of their degree course. And I think something simple as saying, do the file naming convention for your university deliverables is one way of not showing them it's a BIM thing, it's just the way industry do things. And it doesn't always have to be labeled BIM, it's just good practice. And I think weaving it in really helps.
Definitely, and yeah, I'd highly recommend making sure that you have a naming convention of some sort. So when you're at university, rather than saying final, 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 this is actually the final, just to for anyone's sanity. Um, we've got a question in from Timothy. If you currently have a BIM Level 2 accreditation with, say, LRQA, how does this fit within the new UK BIM framework, and how is it termed?
So that question I won't answer because I don't know how LRQA operates. But if I were to hazard a guess, I would imagine that that sort of organization, when they get to their renewal period for their certification, which I think is normally around 3 years' time, they may be able to look at it and now say, right, we've now developed the scheme based on the UK BIM framework, and it would transition over, is how I personally would do it. But I don't know the details of LRQA, which I believe is the rebranding of Lloyd's Register, in terms of specifically how they work. But I think the easiest one is to go back to them and ask.
Great. And then we've got a final question in from Rory. Thanks for the presentation, Dan. As ISO 19650 is superseding PAS 1192, currently there are projects I have experienced where PAS is still being mandated. Is there a plan for when PAS will be totally withdrawn and clients will not be able to mandate the use of PAS? Apologies if this was discussed and I missed it.
No, that's fine. And I think the answer, which is clear but probably will disappoint Rory, is that because standards by their nature are voluntary, there's no reason why someone couldn't turn around and just ask for an 80-year-old standard or something if they have a copy to it and ask for it. But I think ultimately what we have is there's recognition of what good practice is, and good practice kind of will evolve in that way. But as I said, if there were long programs for consistency, otherwise you can understand why someone might want to still require the PAS, which is quite an important thing, because if you've been procuring for something like Crossrail for the last 10-15 years and then all of a sudden you're being asked to change something, why, when 95% of the data you've got is already done in one way through one system and one procurement process? So I think it's very much looking at it on an as and when basis, and hopefully as seasoned professionals, we're looking to have a collaborative relationship with such clients. And it might be that you follow the PAS process this time, but you guide them into seeing what the differences are, introduce them to the transition guide, and maybe on the next project, you can advise them on how it actually should work from a 19650 process. But from a BSI mechanical point of view, they're labeled as withdrawn, and that's as far as we go.
Great, thank you for that. I've decided a couple of links. One is obviously that CPD event that you mentioned, which is going to be in September, and I've also included a link to There's No BIM Like Home, which is an award-winning blog which Dan created and produced and continues to input, and also it forms part of an update within the AT journal on every single issue of that has a spread which explains certain aspects of the BIM blog. So I encourage you to have a look at the website and just get yourself understanding the way in which the thought process of including standards, etc., could potentially be included in something as small as a house. So thank you for that, Dan. I'm just going to quickly run it over a couple of our events coming up. So I'm just going to quickly share my screen. Hopefully a poster is showing up on the front. Is that right, Dan?
Yes, I can see your security poster.
Okay, great. Yeah, so our next event is a face-to-face event, which is on Wednesday, the 17th of August at the Engine Shed, which is very close by to Temple Meads, within a minute's walking distance. And that's on Wednesday, 17th of August, 6:30 to 9 o'clock. This is a very senior UK government security advisor. We last held the event a few years ago, pre-COVID, and would highly recommend anyone who has or has yet to attend any talks by this individual. It's extremely interesting and very engaging, and really opens a whole nother sphere of understanding of how we design our built environment and things that we need to take into consideration. So please do sign up to that via our Eventbrite page. Our next event that we have in August, which is part of the CPD in 43 series, which is on Wednesday, the 24th of August, is from AGIA, which is a flood risk screening for schemes. So again, obviously, this will be made available via the Eventbrite page, so please do sign up. Following that, on Wednesday, 21st of September, we have Kind Mineral Paints, which is a really interesting talk looking at a very sort of detailed aspect of these paints, which can be used from various applications in addition to listed buildings. So please do come along to that and sign up via the usual method. Then we have our October event, which is on Wednesday, 26th of October. Again, lunchtime as usual, a planning and regeneration update following our previous talk from them. It was requested from many attendees to give an annual update on planning and regeneration within the UK. So I'm looking forward to that, because naturally, as with our British standards, as with our building regulations and planning, changes are happening on a regular basis. And then our November event, which is on Wednesday, 23rd of November, again, as part of our CPD in 43 series, is from a sustainability consultant, and specifically on achieving net zero carbon in construction. We don't have a poster for our following events, which are subsequent to that, but that is verbally, I can announce that we have an event in December, which is Autodesk Space Maker, which is quite an interesting piece of software. So for very early feasibility and understanding how you can do massing, etc. And then between that, we have our AGM in Bristol. So that's on November the 25th. Will be a number of events being held in Bristol on the day, which will be an insight at the Engine Shed, which was mentioned. In the evening, we will have a get together, as many people who may have attended previous AGMs will know. So I encourage you to attend on Friday, the 25th of November, but please do sign up and purchase tickets, etc. And then obviously for any voting delegates, there'll be the AGM on Saturday, the 26th of November. So I look forward to seeing anyone at either of our face-to-face events, in addition to the AGM, which is being organised between CPD Wessex and also for the formalities from central office. So thank you again, Dan. Really insightful, and judging from the questions, it was really appreciated from everyone that was in attendance. So thank you again from everyone from CIAT Wessex. Thank you again from CIAT Wales representation, and just generally, it was yeah, really useful and very insightful.
No, you're very welcome. Thank you.